Okay, so thanks everybody for being here. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Ran Martin. Dr. Ran Martin is Trethewey Early Career Professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Penn State University. She received the Bachelor in Mechanical Engineering from Delaware, University of Delaware. Then she did a Master and Ph.D. at University of Notre Dame, 200 kilometers north of here, something like that. She's holding an NSF career grant and I think an NSF CMMI grant, I don't know how to say, in civil mechanical engineering. So then she's doing research in biomechanics, in mechanobiology, control theory, and she directs the Go Lab at PSU, as shown in her slide. She's interested in understanding many aspects of human biomechanics, in particular about working, but also other topics. And she uses tools from engineering, but also control theory and optimization to understand what's going on when humans and robots do something called working. Okay. And so without further ado, I will just leave the stage to Dr. Martin. So thanks a lot.
Okay, yes. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for attending. So as you can see from my title, I will be talking about feet today. And specifically, I will be talking about curved feet and both how we can model them and the impact they have on walking. Let's see. All right, so why do we care about feet? One of the major reasons is that feet are the interface between the biped and the rest of the environment. So correctly designed feet can play a large role in the mechanics of walking. Now, human feet are particularly complicated. They have a lot of degrees of freedom. They have a lot of actuation, both passive and active. And pretty much nobody actually models all the degrees of freedom in the human foot, particularly if you're looking at a full walking motion. It's just too complicated. So this figure, or these figures, show the human feet. You can see there's a lot of bones in them. So one of the major movements in the human foot during walking is called the windlass mechanism. So basically at the beginning of the step, you have a force pushing down from the tibia, which basically flattens the arch. And then as the step progresses and the toes start to bend, the plantar fascia tightens. And then at the end of the step, everything releases. So that impacts the energy flow in the foot between basically the rest of the human and the ground. Now, if you have an assisted device, you're likely to have a foot plate in order to attach this device to the person. And it's possible that this foot plate can mess up the foot movement. So for example, in this figure over on the left, basically the colored part is a powered exoskeleton. And you're going to strap it to the person basically at the thigh, at the shank down in this middle, and then you have a foot plate that goes under the foot with some straps over the foot to attach this whole exoskeleton to the person. So because the foot plate is generally rigid, that's going to generally keep the foot from behaving in its normal manner. So we'd like to know, what impact does that have on walking? And just in general, we'd like to be able to understand, how does changing the foot affect walking? So we have a couple different options in order to study this. One option is to do human subject experiments, and I'll discuss some work we've done with that later on in the talk. The other option is to use models, either mathematical models or robots, which you can think of as sort of a mechanical model of a human. Now, if we're talking about mathematical models, they can range from very simple to very complex. So on the simplistic end of the spectrum are very simple mechanical models that are particularly well suited for answering a specific research question. For example, In the figure that's shown here, this model is looking at the effect of step length on the amount of energy required to walk. So because these models are so simple, they lead to easily testable hypotheses, but you lose a lot of the details of walking when you use them. At the other end of the spectrum are three-dimensional musculoskeletal models. So these models are very complex. They include a lot of details of the human, and they tend to include many of the muscles in the human body. These models are particularly well suited for looking at how different muscles impact gait. However, for a lot of research questions, what you want is something in the middle. You want something a little bit more complicated than the simplistic models, so you can get some details like knee and ankle movements, but you don't want something so complex like the three-dimensional musculoskeletal models because it's just too computationally expensive to deal with. And that's where my work fits in. So my work is based off of a model called hybrid zero dynamics. This was a technique that was originally developed for planar biped robots. So in this video, you'll see several robots walking under HCD-based control. So one of the key ideas behind HCD-based control is that the progression of the step is driven by the movement of the hip rather than time itself. That's not going to be hugely important for the talk today. And something else you can see in these videos is that all these robots have point feet. So basically they have the leg and then it just ends in a point. And something that you can't hear in the video because I have the sound turned off is that when these robots' legs hit the ground, it makes a big thunk. So it's losing a lot of energy at the transition between steps. And the original formulation also doesn't allow for any type of feet on these robots. So what I'll be discussing today is some work I've done in how do we incorporate feet into this model. So before I discuss those details, the first thing I'll do is I'll give you a little bit more of an overview of the model, particularly the human model. Then I'll discuss how I extended the model to allow for circular feet. I'll discuss an experimental study we did with robots, looking at how changing the foot shape affects robot gait. I'll then discuss a further extension of the model so that we can have non-uniform curved feet, which will make the model a bit more human-like. And then finally, I'll discuss a human subject experiment we did looking at what is the impact of foot plates by themselves on human walking. All right, so to begin, let's talk about the model itself. So in this video, and in most of the videos you'll see in this presentation, you're looking at a side view of the biped model. This purple dot is the hip, and then the model has two legs. It has a red stance leg, which is the leg that is on the ground, and then it has a blue swing leg, which is the leg that is in the air. Every step consists of two phases. There is a finite time single support phase, which only has one foot on the ground, and this can be modeled using continuous second-order differential equations. And then there is a discrete impact phase, where the model switches from one step to the next, and the stance leg switches as well. So this impact phase can be modeled using an algebraic mapping. So the human model has a total of 6 links. It has 2 legs, each with a thigh, a shank, and a foot. And each of these links has mass. And then we also have a point mass at the hip to represent the upper body. The model has a total of 5 ideal actuators, 1 at the hip, 1 at each knee joint, and 1 at each ankle joint. The interface between the foot and the ground is unactuated, and so because of that, this model is underactuated by 1 degree of freedom, which means we don't have direct control over the global orientation of the model. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about feet, and human feet in particular. So from previous research, we know that the human foot serves 2 purposes. It helps to control the center of pressure location, and it helps to control the center of mass acceleration. Now, as I said earlier, the human foot is very complex, so I don't want to model the form of the human foot. Instead, I'm going to model the function of the human foot. So in order to model the control of the center of pressure location, I'm going to use the idea of the foot-ankle rollover shape. So in this figure of experimental data from Andy Hansen, this top black dot is the knee, this middle black dot is the ankle, and then these lower black dots are the center of pressure from heel contact to opposite heel contact. And what you can see is that the center of pressure forms a roughly circular arc. So that means we can model the function of the control of the center of pressure movement using a circular foot. Now, because I am choosing to model the function of the human foot rather than the form, I'm going to place the ankle joint on the diameter of my foot circle. So this is obviously much higher than the physiological ankle joint. And as we'll discuss quite a bit later in the talk, this actually ends up being a problem if you want to model ankle angles, but we will get there later. All right, so now the question is this circular foot enough to capture the whole function of the human foot and ankle complex, or do we also need ankle joints to help control the ground reaction forces? So in order to test this, I created two models. I created a full-length model without ankles, and that is shown in the top row of this video. And then I created a 6-link model with ankles, and that's shown in this bottom row. I then matched experimental data and simulation data as closely as possible. So specifically, I found model gaits that matched experimental data as closely as I could. So in these plots, the dashed line is the experimental data, and the solid line is the simulation data. This middle set of plots shows the hip angles. The right set of plots shows the knee angles. And as you can see, the model with ankles did a much better job of matching the experimental data than the model without ankles. And this was true across all the walking speeds that I tested. As a result, I concluded that the model needed both curved feet and ankles in order to walk in a human-like manner. Okay, so now that you know a little bit more about the model, let's go into some of the technical details about how do we model curved or circular feet.
Can I ask you a question really quickly?
Yes.
So there are no springs, right?
Correct, no springs. Everything in this work is basically just rigid bodies with no compliance.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay. So in order to create the model, so for the single support phase, we can use standard equations of motion. It's relatively easy to find these equations of motion using the method of Lagrange if you have circular feet, because it's straightforward to find the position of the ankle because the curvature of the foot is constant, and once you know the position of the ankle, you can work your way up and down the chain in order to find all the other relevant velocities. So the impact event is a little bit more challenging. So it's going to use the same general form of the equations. It's going to use Lagrange's equations of motion. This time we're going to set the generalized coordinates as the 6 joint angles plus the XY position of the hip. So because we have these extra 2 coordinates, that means we also have basically Lagrange multipliers into our equation of motion, and they are shown right here in this equation. So if we expand this general form of Lagrange's equations of motion into the more standard rigid body robotics form, we get this. So again, F is the Lagrange multipliers, and this E is going to be the constraint Jacobian. So now we're going to make a few assumptions. The first thing we're going to assume is that the double support period is instantaneous. And because it is instantaneous, we can integrate our equation of motion over the duration of that impact. So this equation here is the same equation as at the bottom of the previous slide. So we can integrate. And now, because the impact is instantaneous, that means the biped does not have any time to move. So the position before and after impact is going to be the same. And we can also assume that the impulsive force that occurs because the front foot slams into the ground dominates all the forces. So that means joint torques and gravitational forces are insignificant. So with those assumptions, we simplify down to this algebraic equation. So in this algebraic equation, we don't know the velocity just after impact, which is QE dot plus, and we don't know the integrated impulsive force is F. We do know what the velocity just before impact is, so we do know what QE dot minus is, and we know what the position of the biped is, so we know what QE is. So at this point, we have 10 unknowns and 8 equations. So we need another 2 equations in order to uniquely solve this system. And these 2 equations come from the constraint equations. And specifically, they are the constraint equations from the post-impact velocity of the hip. So if you set up your constraint equations appropriately, the Lagrange multipliers are going to equal the forces at a point. So now we need to figure out exactly what should our constraint be. So just before impact, the back foot is in contact with the ground, and the center of mass velocity is down and to the right. Then just after impact, we've had an impulsive force acting on the front foot because the front foot slams into the ground. And then the hip velocity is up and to the right. So because this impulsive force occurs at the front foot, that means we want to relate the velocity of the hip to the velocity of this, basically the joint velocities of this biped, assuming that the front foot is rolling without slip. So that gives us the final 2 equations. We have a square linear system, which makes it trivial to solve for the unknowns. So now that I have the model, the next thing I needed to do was validate it to make sure that it was actually accurate. So in order to perform this validation, I used experimental data from Tad McGear's passive 2-link biped. So a passive biped is a mechanism that can walk down a shallow slope without any additional input energy. This is an ideal case to validate the model because all of the movement comes from the dynamics of the system. So we don't have to deal with any type of controller. So this video here basically shows Tad McGear's walker walking down the slope. So these plots show the experimental data and the predicted data. The experimental data is in purple with error bars shown for the range, and then the predicted data is in yellow. The left plot shows the step period, and the right plot shows the angle between the legs at impact. And as you can see, there's a very good match between the experimental data and the predicted data, which gives us a lot of confidence that the model is correct. So then the next step was to incorporate this model into the controller. So this video shows the biped Ernie walking with the curved foot HCD model and controller. So Ernie was the robot in my graduate student lab. And as you can see, Ernie is able to consistently walk in a stable manner with the curved feet. So now the other thing we'd like to check is to make sure that the curved foot model and controller actually works better than just using the point foot model. So in order to test this, I created 2 models in simulation. I had my curved foot model, and then I had the old point foot model. I created gates for the biped Ernie, and then I tested both of them on the exact same physical setup. And in this physical setup, Ernie had curved feet. And then what I did is I compared the errors between these 2 categories of models. And what I would expect is the curved foot model should have lower errors because it is a better match to the experimental system. So this plot shows the speed that Ernie walked at on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis shows the maximum RMS error from the experiments. The data from the curved foot model gaits is shown with these light blue circles, and the data from the mixed gaits, basically where I had the model that had point feet, but the hardware had curved feet, is shown with these dark squares. And as you can see, for a given speed, the curved foot model consistently had lower errors. This is what we would expect because the model matched the experiment. Okay, so now that I've shown you that we can control a
Can I ask you another question?
Yep,
So actually, I have a couple, but I'll try to be quick. So it's hybrid because the vector field changes every time the robot touches the ground, correct?
Correct. It's hybrid because you basically are alternating between a single support phase and a double support phase.
Right. And for what concerns the last slide, so how many extra parameters do you have in the case with the curved foot?
There's just two extra parameters.
Two extra
Basically, the
parameters.
radius of the foot, and then we can also shift basically where the center of curvature is located relative to the shank.
Well, the reason for which I'm asking is that you know you want to also control for the extra parameters that you use, right? Namely, when you add two extra parameters, you have a little bit more flexibility. So there is some sort of disadvantage from the previous model, the one with less parameters.
Okay, so from a controls perspective, there's actually identical number of parameters between the two models. It's
Right.
only mechanical. So basically, there's two extra parameters in the model, but you can't adjust them once the model is walking. Basically, you have a fixed curved foot radius and a fixed ankle offset. So the controller itself, the freedom in the controller itself is identical between the two. So, all right, something I didn't get into, but I think I'll explain now, that'll make it a little bit more sense. So the way the controller works is the output is defined as the error between a desired trajectory and the current trajectory. And then we can use feedback linearization to figure out what the appropriate control torques should be. So the control parameters are basically choosing the desired trajectories. And since the two models have the same number of degrees of freedom, the control parameters we have the same number of control parameters.
Right. So at the end, the two models have the same amount of degrees of freedom. So then my question is answered, because in that case then there is no advantage with one model with respect to the other. It's just one that it's a better set of variables that are used, and the other is worse set of variables than used. Good.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good.
Yep. What you'll see actually in this next section is there is actually some other advantages with having curved feet. It can reduce energy expenditure. But let me get to that. All right, so if we want to look at, all right, so basically the purpose of this study was to look at the effect of changing parameters of the foot on the biped gait. And specifically, I looked at changing two foot parameters. One is the radius of the foot. So you can see that in this left figure here. So I can make the radius either small or large. And then the second parameter is I can shift the center of curvature forwards or back. And we called this shift of center of curvature location ankle offset for shorthand. And then I also tested 3 different walking speeds. So I performed a full factorial study, and I did experiments both in simulation as well as in hardware, again using the biped Ernie. So this video shows some of the results. It's comparing basically no ankle offset, so the center of curvature is located right underneath the shank, and that is shown on the left, and then the right video shows a large ankle offset. And what I found was that as you increase, sorry, this one's foot radius. So left is showing a small foot radius, so you can see the foot looks short, and then the right is showing a large foot radius. And what I found is that as the foot radius increases, you have to increase the swing knee flexion, which makes sense because if you have a larger foot radius, in general, the foot is going to be longer, so you have to pick your swing foot up more in order to avoid scuffing the ground. And then we also found that for a given step, the distance that the foot rolls from one heel contact to the next heel contact increases, which also makes sense because if you have a larger foot radius, basically you have more foot you can roll over. So then if we look at ankle offset, so if we shift the center of curvature from directly under the shank to in front of the shank, that also tends to increase swing knee flexion. Again, this is probably to avoid foot scuffing because it shifting the ankle offset forward shifts the foot forward, so you have to pick it up more in order to avoid scuffing the ground. And then finally, I looked at the effect of foot design on how much energy is required to walk. So both of these plots show the ankle offset on the horizontal axis, the specific energetic cost of transport on the vertical axis. So this is a normalized measure of how much energy it takes to walk. And then the smallest foot radius is shown with the diamonds. The middle foot radius is shown with the circles, and the largest foot radius is shown with the triangles. Hardware data is shown on the left, and simulation data is shown on the right. And what I found is that you either want a large foot radius and minimal to no ankle offset, or you want a large ankle offset and a small foot radius in order to get the most energetically efficient walking. So there's a trade-off between the two. You don't want both of them to be large or both of them to be small. All right, any questions? Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about circular feed, I'm going to discuss a further extension of the model to allow non-uniform curved feet. So if you have these circular feet with the ankle joints well above the biological ankle, it's possible to produce very human-like walking movements, particularly if you only look at the hip and the knees. You cannot generate human-like ankle movements, though. And this is probably partly due to the fact that the ankle joint on the model is way above the ankle joint for the human. And it's probably also due to the fact that if you look at the center of pressure in a foot-fixed coordinate frame, it's not as circular as if you look at it in a shank-fixed coordinate frame. So my graduate student, Claire Rodman, did some work looking at what if we have a more flexible curved foot formulation that we can use. So going from a curved foot with a uniform radius of curvature to a curved foot with a non-uniform radius of curvature gets a little tricky because it becomes hard to find the position and velocity of this stance ankle. And you need the position and velocity of the stance ankle so that you can find position and velocity of all the other key points on the biped, because those are needed to find all of these configuration-dependent terms in your equations of motion. So basically your inertial matrix, your matrix's Coriolis and centripetal terms, and your gravity vector. So in order to go about finding the equations of motion for this non-uniform foot, the first thing we did was attach a foot fixed coordinate frame to the ankle. We then defined the foot shape using this function here. So what we said is that the vertical distance of the foot is some function of the horizontal distance of the foot. So then what we can say, just from a purely mathematical perspective, is that for any point along the foot, this foot shape is going to have some slope, and it's simply the derivative of y with respect to x. And for later use, we're going to call this derivative g. Now, this slope also makes an angle with respect to this foot fixed x-axis, and we're going to call this angle beta. So now, if we go attach this foot to the ground, the foot is going to contact the ground at some point, which we're going to call C. And we know that the global orientation of the foot has to equal beta. So now what we're going to want to do is we want to be able to find a vector from the origin of the global coordinate frame to this ankle. So it's going to take several steps in order to be able to do this. So the first thing we can do is we can say that for a given configuration of the robot, so for a given value of q, we know what beta is. And if we know what beta is, we know what the slope of the foot has to be at that current point. So we know what g is. So now what we're going to do is we are going to assume that the foot shape function is convex. And because it is convex, that means there is a one-to-one relationship between the slope and the x position on the foot. Now, this relationship may not be analytically invertible, but it exists. So we can use numeric methods to solve for it. Once we know what the x position of the foot is, we can use our foot shape function to figure out what y is. And then once we know x and y, we can find the vector from the ankle to the contact point. We can also basically follow this top path. So once we know the x position of the foot, we can figure out where the position of this contact point is relative to the global coordinate frame by finding the the arc length of this foot. So that gives us this vector down here. So now, in order to find the vector from the origin of the global frame to the ankle joint, we can simply do some vector addition because we have the vector from the ankle to point C and from the origin of the global frame to point C. So at this point, we have enough information to figure out where the ankle is. We are also going to need to know what the velocity of the ankle is. And finding the velocity of the ankle is going to require using the chain rule. So in order to find the velocity of the x position, this xf in the ankle frame, we can solve for beta in terms of xf, take the time derivative, and rearrange and solve for the velocity. In order to figure out this y velocity, again, we can use our foot shape function, differentiate it using the chain rule, and substitute in this x velocity. And then similarly, in order to find the velocity of the contact point, here is our equation for the velocity of the contact point. We differentiate it using the chain rule and substitute in our x velocity. And then we combine these appropriately, and that gives us the global velocity of the ankle. Once we have the global velocity of the ankle, it's pretty straightforward to find the velocity of all the other points in our kinematic chain.
So here you're assuming also that the curved part of the feet doesn't roll over, correct?
Correct. So we're assuming that it is convex and that basically we're only looking at sort of like half of it, or actually in a lot of cases, we end up constraining it to be less than half. All right, so now we want to see whether or not this non-uniform curved foot shape works any better. So in order to test this, we used some experimental data, and we tested 3 different foot shapes. So we tested a circular foot shape, an ellipse, and a polynomial. And this polynomial, the coefficients of the polynomial were constrained to ensure that it was convex. So this figure shows experimental data for one trial, for one subject. So each of these black dots is a data point, and the data was sampled at an even sampling rate of 100 Hertz. So the horizontal axis is the x position of the center of pressure, and then this vertical axis here is the y position of the center of pressure relative to the ankle joint. And the ankle, in this case, is this blue dot right at 0, 0. So we can see is that most of the data lies in front of the ankle joint, which is what we would expect. But we actually have quite a bit of center of pressure data that occurs sort of back behind the ankle. So we have a couple different ways we can go about fitting these curved shapes to the experimental data. So one option is basically we find an average value for each of these x positions and then fit basically through the middle of this cloud of data. However, most of the time people spend walking, their center of pressure is in front of the foot. So instead what we chose to do is we treated each of these time data points individually. So we much more heavily weighted fitting the curve so it matched basically sort of the front part of the foot rather than this tail section. Now you can see that all 3 of these foot shape models fit the data pretty well and that they are very similar. So we wouldn't necessarily expect a whole lot of difference in our results. So this plot shows example spatial temporal data for one subject. So on the horizontal axis, we have a normalized step time, and on the vertical axis, we have a normalized step length. The experimental data is shown with these black squares with standard deviations shown with these error bars. The circle model is shown with the blue triangles. The ellipse model is shown with the orange circles. And the polynomial model is shown with these green triangles. And you can see that all 3 models do a very good job of matching the experimental spatial temporal parameters. And this is true across all of the subjects we tested and across all of the walking speeds we tested. We also got very similar results for the joint trajectories. So in this figure, the left column shows stance angles, the right column shows swing angles, top row shows hip, middle row shows knee, and bottom row shows ankle. The black lines are the experimental data, and then the other 3 lines are the models. And what you can see is that no matter what model we are using, we match the hip angles extraordinarily well. We match the knee angles very well. And we do an adequate job matching the stance ankle angle. We don't do a particularly good job matching the swing ankle angle. We're not entirely sure why, but we've been unable to get a better match. And you can also see that there's not much difference between the 3 foot models. And this is true across subjects and across walking speeds. So what we can conclude from this is that the foot shape doesn't matter hugely. You can use any of these 3 parameterizations, but it is important to have the ankle joint at the biological ankle if you want to get plausible ankle angles. All right, any questions?
So, do you check also the forces? Namely, yeah. So,
The
because it might be
the ground reaction forces?
ground reaction forces. So, because I'm wondering that if those are used to somehow penalize some of the curves or adjust some of the curves, maybe you get the sixth angle a little bit closer. I don't know.
So we've looked at the ground reaction forces a little bit. They don't match particularly well, particularly at the beginning and ends of the step. And I think that's because the model has an instantaneous impact or an instantaneous double support phase, whereas humans have about a 15% of the step cycle is a double support. So instead of slamming their foot into the ground and instantaneously changing feet, humans have a more gradual transition. So we don't get particularly great.
You know,
Yeah.
you have a good idea on the penalizations for front foot versus back part of the foot, right? So maybe you put a higher penalization on the beginning and end of the stance. Namely, you really, yeah, so that maybe that can be a trick.
Yes, that could be something we look at. Any other questions? Okay. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was an experimental study we did looking at the impact of foot plates themselves on human gait. And this study was done by my graduate student, Dave Schmidhenner. So in this study, it was broken up into two parts. So the first part had 12 subjects, and these subjects walked over ground in 3 different conditions. A control condition with just normal shoes, a 3/4 foot plate condition, which the foot plate we used is shown in this top figure, and then a full foot plate condition, and the foot plate we used is shown in this bottom figure. So for the 3/4 condition, basically the back 3/4 of the foot plate was relatively rigid Delrin, and then sort of the front chunk was flexible foam. And we just included the flexible foam so that the foot plate was the same height over the entire length of the foot plate. So basically, in the 3/4 case, subjects could use their toes relatively normally. In the full length condition foot plate, the foot plate was relatively rigid over its entire length. So we had subjects walk at their self-selected speed, and we measured kinematics and kinetics. And for this first part of the study, we used the standard plug-in gait model, which has a single rigid foot part. And then we did a second sub-study in which we had 4 subjects walk on a treadmill. We had basically the same 3 conditions. We had basically a barefoot condition, a condition with a 3/4 length foot plate, and a condition with a full length foot plate. And in this case, we use the Oxford foot model, which breaks the foot into 3 segments. So there's basically a hind foot segment, a midfoot segment, and then this front foot segment. And again, we measured kinematics and kinetics. And then what we wanted to do was see, were these kinematic and kinetic variables different or the same depending on the foot plate condition. So in order to test this, we used a statistical method called 2 one-sided t-tests. And the basic idea of this is that you can test for both statistical equivalence and statistical difference. So statistical equivalence basically means you define some sort of threshold about your difference. And you say that if your data is within this threshold, it's equivalent, and any differences aren't meaningful. If the data falls outside of this threshold, then the differences are meaningful, and we can say that they are statistically different. So what we found is that most of the parameters were statistically equivalent, regardless of the foot plate condition. So in these plots, The control condition is shown in blue. The 3/4 condition is shown with the green dashed line, and then the full foot plate condition is shown with the red dotted line. This top row of plots shows kinematic data. So we have the hip on the left, the knee in the middle, and the ankle on the right. And then the bottom row shows ground reaction forces. So you have medial lateral on the left, anterior posterior in the middle, and vertical ground reaction forces on the right. And what we found is that walking speed, walking cadence, almost all of the joint ranges of motion, and almost all of the ground reaction peak forces were statistically equivalent for all three conditions. What we found is that for the full foot plate, the range of motion for the ankle was slightly smaller, and this initial peak ground reaction force at the beginning of the stride was a little bit smaller if you had the full foot plate. Now, not too surprisingly, the foot plate had a much larger effect on the foot kinematics. So these plots show basically three-dimensional foot kinematics for the front foot, midfoot, and hindfoot. Now, basically shifts in the data aren't meaningful because in order to transition between the different conditions, we had to remove the markers from the foot and then put them back on. And the Oxford foot model is very sensitive to where the markers are actually placed. And so if you, even small errors in marker placement will shift the absolute angles. So the only thing that matters is range of motion. And in general, what we found is that as the foot plate got longer, the range of motion for the foot got smaller, which isn't too surprising because if you have a stiff foot plate on your foot, it's harder to make it move. So that concludes everything I wanted to discuss today. I would like to thank NSF for the funding for this work, as well as my grad students who have done a lot of the work, particularly the more recent work. And thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any more questions.
So let's thank Dr. Marty for the great presentation. So thanks a lot. So I asked several questions. So if other people want to ask before I jump over again, but okay. Other questions? Yes. So Isako Masuda, please.
So, okay.
Right, go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. I'm just curious about the modeling, the curve that you had a row data, and you're trying to fit different curves, the circular model and that one. Yeah, I'm just curious. This on the left-hand side of the ankle point, the deviation from the model, and also wider range of variation. Does it reflect the different roll or different shapes of towards the heel end of the foot, or is it more of mathematical? I don't know, like a better term, like the predicted shape doesn't fit very well. I'm not sure if I can explain it very well.
Okay. So I think the reason that the predicted shape isn't fitting very well is because we prioritized fitting sort of the area to the right where the data is denser. We have some preliminary work that we're still working through with the polynomial where we're using a much, much higher order polynomial, which fits sort of this tail a little bit better. We're not entirely sure sort of what this tail actually represents. We're pretty sure it occurs basically right near the beginning of the step when heel contact is coming down. So some of it might be experimental measurement errors. The getting center of pressure location when you don't have sufficient force on the treadmill is a little dicey. And we also know that basically most of this data is behind the biological foot. So this is units of meter. So like we trim it at basically a 1/4 meter behind the ankle joint, which obviously nobody has a foot back there.
I see. Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Other questions?
Yes, other questions? Maybe I can ask one more. So in practice, the foot doesn't have that curvature part, right? So in practice, it's much different from that. But that seems to me that still you're able to, with just basically any sort of reasonable shape, capture a lot of the dynamics. Now I'm wondering, another thing is that my mind is, right? So the part of the foot in practice is not convex. Okay, so the lowest part is not convex. It just has, it's not even symmetric on the side and something like that, right? But there's something which people call convex relaxation, namely the smallest convex curve which encloses the the non-convex things that you have, or even worse for convex things, right? So maybe that's one thing to try, right? So to try to see if just getting, instead of fitting a curve which is convex, just try to get from the data or from the dynamics of the foot the convex relaxation of that model, so that maybe that's gonna give you some extra accuracy or precision. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. So what we've actually found is probably in order to get really accurate data, it turns out that it's pretty important to basically capture the shape right at the end here. So Claire's currently doing some work seeing what happens if you use a much higher order polynomial. It's a little hard to see in this plot, but there tends to be a slightly increase in curvature sort of right at the front of the foot that's near toe off. So if we capture that, we get slightly better results.
So the thing that so the reason for which I mentioned that is that, for example, the polynomial case actually it's an example of what I was thinking. You mentioned also before about the forces at the end of the beginning end of the stance or something like that, right? So polynomials usually behave bad at extremes of domain of definition, because those polynomials tend to go either to plus infinity or to minus infinity or something like that, right? So at the end of the domain of definition, even if they fit decently well in between, they might fit worse at the end. And then increasing too much, increasing too much then increase the number of parameters. And maybe that you end up like having that, yes, you fit the data well, then you lose a lot of meaningful significance of the parameters that you fit, because either they don't have mechanical significance or biological significance, or you end up overfitting. So, but maybe something which directly comes from the data. Now I said that convex relaxation, but something that the curve chosen comes from the data. Something like a convex curve, the closest convex curve to the shape of foot. So that maybe it's gonna be a possibility.
Yeah, that could be a possibility. My guess is that if we really wanted to get the beginning and the ends of the steps to be a lot more accurate, we'd need to add in a finite time double support period, which it's possible. It makes doing the simulations a whole lot harder. I didn't talk about it in this talk, but one of my previous grad students looked at including a finite time double support period, and it just makes all the simulation and basically finding the gates enormously much harder.
Right. So that actually helped in spring mass models, right? So having the double support spring mass model helped explain it working with respect to original ideas on inverted pendulum and that type of things, right? Yeah, good.
Yep.
Right. Awesome. Yeah. Good.
Yep.
Very good. Thank you. Other questions? Anybody? Well, if there are no other questions, let's thank Dr. Martin again for the great presentation. So thank you very much for the interesting topics we discussed today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.